My name's Aidan Byrne from the University of Wolverhampton. I did a PhD on 1930s Welsh writing in English a few years ago, and my interests are Welsh writing in English generally, but in particular the interwar period and the South Wales valleys.
Excellent. Thank you for introducing yourself, Aidan. Can we now start with the first question then? In terms of popularity, Richard Llywelyn's How Green Was My Valley is a novel of substantial impact. Could you say who Richard Llywelyn was and what it is that makes How Green Was My Valley such a popular book?
Richard Llywelyn made a lot of efforts to disguise who he was in many ways. He used a number of pseudonyms and he hid his date of birth and place of birth, and he claimed many things about himself, including birth in Wales and a career as a miner, which turned out not to be true. His real name was Richard David Llywelyn Lloyd, and he was born in London, the son of a hotel owner, and he appears to have spent very little time in Wales, if any.
All right.
But he was, at least for some of the time, an ardent Welsh nationalist. He served in the army in the Second World War. He wrote quite a lot of novels, including 3 sequels to How Green Was My Valley, and a number of screenplays, and lived across the world, quite often in tax exile, including in Israel.
Quite an adventure then.
Absolutely, he had quite a swashbuckling life, and I think he was motivated mostly when he was moving around the world by avoiding the tax man. He was quite an interesting and right-wing figure, although he never equalled the success of How Green Was My Valley.
All right, okay.
It was a huge hit. It came out in 1939, just before the war started, and it outsold virtually every book of that year and the next 2 or 3 years. It was filmed very quickly, and again, that was a huge success. Outsold tickets to Gone with the Wind that year, and beat Gone with the Wind to the Oscar that year for Best Film.
Wow.
So an immediate sensation.
Yeah.
Why was it so popular? I think it struck a chord with people from all over the world because it painted an image of a prelapsarian, ethnically pure country, which was very seductive to people, certainly on the right.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. What do you find most interesting about the novel?
I think partly it's huge success. It's never been out of print. So it's sold tens of millions of copies, and it's written in this very seductive dream sequence or series of flashbacks. The timing's very interesting. It's a novel about racial purity that comes out months before the UK goes to war with a country that's obsessed with racial purity, and there's nothing else like it. It's very hard to see in this novel what Richard Llywelyn had been reading, and it's hard to see any influences. I don't think anyone followed him in any sense. There's a possible origin in German Heimlich novels, novels of home, but he didn't read German, so I don't think he directly read those. So it's a novel that stands alone in many ways. And of course, in terms of Welsh literature, it's extremely patriotic about Wales and Welsh culture from this man who had little contact with Wales and didn't mix politically or socially with anyone else in Welsh culture at all, really.
That's fascinating.
It is.
Yeah. It's just interesting to think that Wales likes to think of itself as largely unaffected by fascist nationalism. Would you argue in your article that the novel is centrally concerned with fascist ideology? How central is Wales to this ideology?
Well, there was a tiny Welsh right-wing nationalist movement. The Welsh Nationalist Party had just started in the late 30s, and it was influenced by largely French hard-right politics. Not Nazism, but allied to the hard right in France. But it was a tiny, tiny movement. And Richard Llywelyn comes in from London declaring an image of Wales that he's already obituarizing to some extent, because How Green Was My Valley is all about the past. The novel starts with Hugh saying, "Where's it all gone wrong?"
Yeah.
He's leaving the valley, and he's saying, "What's happened to my culture?" And the rest of the novel provides the answers. And the answers he proposes are ones that you don't see anywhere else in Welsh culture. He says it's miscegenation is a problem, internal moral decay, it's subversion by left-wing interlopers. It's the development of class politics, to some extent feminism. Female sexuality is a huge threat in this novel. These are themes that you really don't see elsewhere in Welsh writing in English, or for that matter in Welsh writing in Welsh. So it's a very strange novel, I think. And it succeeds to some extent because it frames all these things in this kind of dreamlike romance set in this pre-lapsarian Wales that gradually decays. So it's kind of Jeremiah against modernity to some extent, and you really don't get that elsewhere.
No. How does the novel enact the concerns of post-First World War conservatism and fascism then?
What you get is a series of encounters between our young hero, Hugh, as he grows up, and the forces which are destroying society, and they're forces which turn up in popular English literature of the time. So foreigners, left-wing subversive invaders. So there's a particularly striking scene where a man who's raped a child is led up the mountain by the local priest, chapel leader, and there's a lynch mob with flaming torches, and they murder him up on the mountain. And it's significant that this man is what they call a half-breed. He's half English, half Welsh, and it's clear that his moral decay is directly linked to the fact that he's neither one nor the other. And yet, an authorially approved lynch mob led by a religious leader is a pretty hard line politically.
Yeah.
There are the striking miners gradually lose control and lose their Welshness, it said, when they throw off the leadership of Hugh's father, who is a symbol of the old Wales, where moral virtue is part of the Gwerin tradition. It's the kind of respectable working class. Once they start developing class politics and listening to these shadowy, subversive agitators, then they lose all moral authority in this. So what you get is a politics of Welsh culture as the defender of eternal values to some extent. So monarchism is stressed repeatedly, Welsh culture over class culture, and male leadership. It's a novel that's obsessed with male sexuality, or male sexual power. It kind of relates to Yeats and his group's theories of male power being the root of moral and social authority. So it's particularly interesting that sexuality as it's practiced is condemned as socially destructive, but true moral authority comes from male sexual potential to some extent. So having sex is wrong, but having male sexuality is the key to leadership, and part of the tension is between Hugh's desires to exercise his sexuality and his realisation that he should divert this power towards moral action. And women are objects of extreme suspicion. They're either gossips or they're vampire figures draining male moral purpose, much as in a lot of popular literature in English at the time. So there's Cynwen, who is an enfolding, threatening sexual figure. You know, she's soft and round and enticing. And she leads Hugh astray. He's meant to fall in love with poor old Shani, who is dying of TB and is thin and kind and rural. And she symbolises the real Wales, which is being destroyed by people like Cynwen, who are dissipating moral and sexual authority. It's a very strange novel.
It is. It sounds very strange, doesn't it?
But nobody notices this. I think people, it's read so widely, except perhaps slightly less in Wales. Nobody notices the strangeness or the rather threatening politics of this novel. It's seen as a romance because it's framed as a series of nostalgic flashbacks to a time past. And there's a lot of very seductive images of Wales. Male voice choirs, good food, high wages before the men start rebelling against natural authority. So it's painted as a romance, but underneath the politics are quite frightening. And the discourse of the novel is very, very seductive. So,
what is Llywelyn's vision for the future of Wales in this novel, which was published in 1939?
I think it was a vision of decay.
Mm-hmm.
The novel is a series of flashbacks as he wants to work out where it's gone wrong, and he leaves. He leaves mining for a start to become a carpenter, because there's this fear of mechanisation turning the men into brutes rather than autonomous craftsmen, which is partly where the miners go wrong in this novel's version. And then Hugh leaves in the end. He thinks it's all over. The socialists have overtaken moral authority and proper, pure Welsh leadership, and there doesn't seem to be a solution anymore.
Yeah. Is there actually, just out of interest, the sequels, do they also look at the past, or do they sort of create a vision of what the future's bringing?
The sequels follow Hugh as he leaves Wales, and
right, and he follows
travels around looking for pure communities in various places, including South America, where there is a small Welsh population.
Yeah.
And the very last one is a very strange novel, partly funded by the Welsh Arts Council for reasons I've never quite been able to ascertain, in which aged Hugh comes back to Wales and he's very, very rich, and he gets caught up in a series of plots involving some rather frightening lesbians and the IRA. It's kind of beyond comprehension in many ways, but it's a much cruder version of the Conservative politics that you see in How Green Was My Valley.
Yeah, oh, interesting. Now thinking about the film, how did the 1941 film adaptation by John Ford deal with the novel's ideological content?
Largely by ignoring it. There's still a strike in there.
Yeah. And
the men throw off Hugh's father's leadership. So the strike is still there, but everything else is avoided. It's a deeply romanticised film, and it was filmed in the US with the help of a Welsh male voice choir that happens to be in the area, but mostly an Irish cast. And it's part of John Ford's romanticisation of Celticism in general. He didn't really see much difference between the Irish and the Welsh. He saw them really as figures of the Celtic twilight. So he saw it as a working out of that kind of pre-modernist consciousness that the Celtic nations got put into in this period. So it's a very soft-edged film, and I suspect that contributed to the novel's popularity. I think people often see the novel through the film.
Yeah, absolutely. This is quite interesting. We're discussing this novel, which seems to be quite controversial, and your feelings perhaps are mixed about the book. If you were asked to recommend 3 Welsh novels to students, would How Green Was My Valley be among them?
Not in terms of quality, although it is ingeniously constructed. But it really offends my politics in pretty much every way. But it is a fascinating novel, and it's a kind of counter to the sense we often get in academia, that Wales was always a place of left-wing class solidarity and socialism. So I think it's an essential read to understand certainly the 30s and Welsh perspective. But it's not exactly a Welsh novel. I'd be disinclined.
Is it just set in Wales and the politics transcend it?
I think it does. John Harris wrote an interesting article quite a long time ago about readers' reactions to How Green Was My Valley, and he got thousands of letters from all over the world, so it struck a chord, particularly from people in small nations surrounded by larger, more dominant ones. So he quotes Danish letters from people, and Germany's next door, and politics are getting hotter, and people respond to this idea of small nations having their distinctiveness rubbed away.
Yeah.
So I think that's partly why it was such a success. Yeah. So I'm not sure I would claim any authenticity for it. Not that you'd want to claim authenticity for any particular novel, but it's certainly not an insider's novel. It's a particularly romanticised first-generation emigrants novel, perhaps, because Llywelyn's father was Welsh.
Yeah.
What would I recommend?
Yeah.
From the 1930s, in English, I adore Gwyn Thomas's work, particularly the early stuff, before it became a bit too much of a comic entertainer. So, Sorrow for Thy Sons, I think, is a superb novel, and very much counter to the romanticisation of How Green Was My Valley. If I was going to recommend novels from the recent period about Valley's life, Christopher Meredith's Shifts is a fascinating examination of what happens to masculinity after mass industry disappears. It's quite a depressing novel in many ways, but it's fascinating and beautifully written. And one little-known novel published by Seren a few years ago is Richard John Evans' Entertainment.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a novel about, it's a Bildungsroman. Again, it's a young man making his way in the world, except there's not much chance to make his way.
Yeah.
So it's kind of aimless, but it's also very, very funny, very spirited, very individual.
Oh.
Outside the Valleys, I guess in English, some of Niall Griffith's work is very interesting.
Sorry, who?
Niall Griffith.
Yes. Yeah.
I think his Wreckage is a particularly interesting exploration, not just of cultural isolation, but also of where people come from. Wreckage traces the immediate lives of two Scouse scumbags, but also traces their origins and how people came from Ireland and Wales and made a life for themselves, and the moral and social compromises that have to be made just to survive. So it's social decay, but social decay with a genuine origin. So I think his work is absolutely fascinating. But my favourite author from the 1930s is Lewis Jones.
Yes.
His Kamadi and We Live, who I think is hugely underrated, partly because his supporters claim that it's just an orthodox communist novel of propaganda, which I think is completely wrong. So that's something I talk about all the time to anyone who'll listen.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much for speaking to me.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it very much.